Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar hosted by the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. I want to thank you for your time today, and a special thank you to our speakers and our moderators. Before we get started, I do want to just go over a few housekeeping items. You can enter your questions into our Q&A section here in the GoToWebinar platform, and then we will get to them at the end of the presentations. If you do have any technical difficulties, you can call the number on the screen, and then our support center will be able to assist you. I'll put this number in the chat as well. This webinar is 1 hour and it's worth one continuing education unit, but you must remain on the full webinar to receive this. And after the webinar, it will be automatically added to your account. So with that, I will pass it off to Richard. He's with ARA as one of our co-hosts for today. And then again, a special thank you to our sponsors. We have CropLife America, Council of Producers and Distributors of Agrotechnology, and then Agricultural Retailers Association. So thank you to our sponsors for supporting this program today. Richard, I'll pass it to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. We appreciate the partnership with the CCAs and CropLife and CPDA. It's a very important topic, and certainly look forward to listening to our speakers today. And I'll just give you a background on ARA. Our membership, our core membership, are agricultural retailers and distributors, which sell all the critical products to farmers so they can have a successful crop and provide agronomic services and application services as well. So this topic related to ESA and pesticide labeling is a pretty important issue for our members and their farmer customers. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. It's Kyle Kunkler, Director of Government Affairs with the American Soybean Association, Leah Duzy, Principal Consultant and Agricultural Economist at Compliance Services International, and Megan Dwyer, CCA and Director of Conservation and Nutrient Stewardship with the Illinois Corn Growers. And I think I left off Leah has a PhD, so call her doctor maybe as well. And look forward to listen to their comments today and questions from the audience later on in the program. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today from both the crop advisors and today's sponsors as well. As Richard introduced, my name is Kyle Kunkler. I'm with the American Soybean Association. I'm with the Government Affairs team for ASA. And in addition to handling pesticide policy, Endangered Species Act policy, I manage other policy areas for ASA as well, including biotechnology and other matters of public affairs. I'll turn it to Megan for her introduction.
Thanks, Kyle. Megan Dwyer, as you heard earlier, I serve as the as Illinois Corn's Conservation and Nutrient Stewardship Director, also a fourth-generation farmer in Northwest Illinois and certified crop advisor. So really excited to be here to kind of talk about what ESA is going to mean for you all as you engage and go forward into the spring. Focus on a lot of water quality conservation issues for Illinois corn, primarily on the federal side, get into the regulatory policy side as well. Crop insurance and a whole host of things. So excited to be here, and I'll let Leah give her introduction.
Thanks, Megan. I'm Leah Duzy. I'm a principal consultant with Compliance Services International, and I'm also a technical lead for the FIFRA Endangered Species Task Force, or FESTF, FESDF, a lot of different things. My background is in production agriculture. I've spent 15 years with USDA prior to moving over to CSI, and all of the work we do is in pesticides and ESA, at least on the team that I'm on. And so this is something that we've really been focusing on for the last 30 years as a company. And so I'm looking forward to today and being able to talk to you about it.
Great, thanks. Well, I get the opportunity and the pleasure to kick things off today. And from my experience, this topic is one that can get very technical very quickly. It can be a very deep topic, and there's a lot of nuances. And in order to better understand those, it's good to have sort of a sound foundation of kind of why we are where we are, what the Endangered Species Act is, what does it require, and to do a little bit of table setting before we get into some of the strategies or the work plan that EPA has proposed. So I get the opportunity and the pleasure to set some of those foundations with you all today. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the Endangered Species Act is, in and of itself, is nothing new. It was first enacted by Congress and signed into law in 1973, and it's a very well-intentioned law. The goal is to prevent, if there are any sort of species that are at risk of extinction, it would help to put in place protections to ensure that their species populations will not be jeopardized, or any critical habitat that those species rely on will not be adversely modified. It entrusts the expertise of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. Collectively, they are the services, are the species experts within the federal government, and it's their roles and responsibilities of engaging with other federal agencies to ensure that their activities are not going to harm listed species. It can be very rigid in that the ESA requires that if a species is listed as endangered, that you are not allowed to, or even threatened for that matter, you can't conduct in any sort of activities that would result in a take of that species. And that's a very broad and inclusive definition, which includes things such as harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect. Again, very broad. But it also has this requirement that if there is a federal agency action, there has to be an assurance that that action is not going to result in what we call JAM, the jeopardy or adverse modification of either the species population themselves or the critical habitat of that species that's necessary for the population's continued survival and well-being. Right now, and it's up to the services. They're the ones that are, as the species experts, review any sort of proposals for listing species or make recommendations themselves for listing species. Currently, there are approximately 1,700 listed species that are found in all 50 states, all U.S. territories, even overseas, and approximately about half of them are plants and about half of them are animals. The activities that are related to the pesticide regulations that we're going to be discussing today are specifically focused on those species that are listed that are found domestically, however. So when we're talking about what is an agency action that's required to be reviewed for its impact on species, what would that entail? And it could potentially be any sort of federal action. That could be a permitting for for a bridge or a road, or fishing or mining permits. And of particular interest to us is going to be that of pesticide registrations and the uses that are pursuant from those registrations. So what does that look like? What does that come with? That responsibility come with? So let's take for a moment and assume that there is a bridge that would be being permitted by the Department of Transportation, and it's going to cross a creek where there may be an endangered turtle in the creek. It's up to the Department of Transportation and that bridge applicant to do an assessment and determine whether or not there are any endangered species that are within the area. And if they identify that there is this endangered turtle in the creek, they then have to do an assessment to determine whether or not they think that bridge may impact that turtle. And that's a very, very low threshold. If there is a possibility that it may be impacted, then they have a responsibility to go consult with Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. It's then up to the services to do an assessment and a determination of whether or not they agree that turtle species may be impacted or not. And if the finding is not, that the species won't be that bridge won't result in jeopardy or adverse modification of the species, then the DOT can go ahead and permit, the company can go ahead and build the bridge. If there's a possibility that jam might occur to that turtle species, then they have to pursue what are called reasonable and prudent measures or alternatives. And that can be things like, for example, they would work together in that consultation process to make a prediction of, well, could we maybe build in place special trusses to protect the turtle, or maybe move the bridge downstream half a mile. Generally, they try to find solutions to address how to protect the species before outright denying a project, and that's what that consultation process is all about. If we can go to the next slide, please. Is there a possibility of going to the next slide? Oh, here we go. Sorry, thank you. It's showing up now on my screen. Pesticide registrations are not bridges over creeks. They are much more complicated than that. And a pesticide registration, as many of you all know, has dozens of crop uses that could be registered, for which they could be used on hundreds of millions of acres, and it may intersect with nearly all of the or most of those 1,700 listed species. What further complicates the situation as well is that there's a requirement under FIFRA that pesticide registrations have to be reviewed once every 15 years. And so right now there's a requirement before EPA to have approximately 900 active ingredients that they have to review. That deadline, initial 15-year deadline, was October 2022, so at least over a couple years ago. And there was a 4-year extension that was offered to EPA to do this work, especially in light of their ESA responsibilities. So that new deadline for completing all of these active ingredients is now October 1st of 2026, in which they have to re-review all of these 900 or so active ingredients for re-registration, to say nothing of any sort of new active ingredients. And they would potentially have to review every single one of those across this list of 1,700 species to make a determination on whether it may impact that species or not. This is an enormous workload, and it is not simply building a bridge over a creek with one species that might be impacted. If we can go to the next slide, please. This chart just gives you sort of an indication of how this process would normally work out. And normally, the law would actually require that this process all plays out over the course of several months for a standard project, say that's like permitting for something like a bridge or a road or something like that. That the purple box is where you would see the original agency action, where they would be making that determination of whether it might impact a species or not. If it doesn't impact a species, they can move forward with their work, and if not, then they have to go through that process of consulting with the services. And then you can see there's sort of those two tracks depending upon what the services findings are. If there would not be necessarily a impact, they can advance a no jam impact. They could advance in that action. But if there is, then they may have to determine reasonable and prudent measures or alternatives for protecting any species predicted to be result from jam from that species. Again, this is normally would take several months to play out. Is ideally, and then the law would prescribe that. However, with pesticide registrations, because they are so complex, that initial assessment on EPA's part up in the purple box we're finding is taking a couple of years to play out often. And the services are also very limited in their staff. The staff that they have available, they have a very small workload to do all of this work, to say nothing of any sort of other actions that might require consultation as well. So that process within the green box and pursuant to those green boxes is taking a couple other years, at least 2 or 3 more years to play out. And what we're finding in the meantime, if you could advance to the next slide, the litigation process in the federal against any sort of pesticide registrations is often playing out faster than the regulatory processes. If EPA issues a registration action that doesn't contain sufficient protections for endangered species pursuant to the law, then they run the risk of having a lawsuit filed against that registration action. And what we're seeing again is federal judges can issue rulings on these registrations that may not be compliant with the law faster than the services can conduct a consultation. And that's resulting in a huge problem, because the farmer community and the applicator community are losing pesticide registrations as a result of these lawsuits. And ESA noncompliance is at the center of many of these challenges. If you can go to the next slide, please. So how do we get out of this? Well, what's the solution? EPA has decided and agreed to do this in a court settlement that What we could perhaps do is find efficiencies in this process. Instead of going chemical by chemical, species by species, maybe what we can do is develop a common set of mitigations for classes of chemicals. So you think of your herbicides or your insecticides, and EPA has advanced in many cases, or in some cases finalized strategies for putting together a common set of mitigations that would serve as sort of an umbrella set that they could then integrate into registration decisions moving forward that would be sufficiently protective on the front end, what we call upfront mitigations, if you will. And that would be allow for protection of listed species while that consultation process with the services is playing out. And this is a way to make sure that registrations are protective. They contain any necessary mitigations to ensure that jam does not occur. And then buy enough time for the rest of that regulatory process to play out on that back end. EPA has agreed to do all of this. I mentioned per court settlement, but one thing that's really important to mention here is that this isn't a self-implementing. These strategies are not self-implementing. They will only be in place moving forward once they are integrated into new registrations. Right now, we only have a few that have these mitigations that are included, but I think you'll see more and more, get these mitigations and have them included on the label moving forward. To date, it's only a few: Enlist and Liberty Ultra, and I think some of my colleagues are planning to address these further in the webinar. If we can go to the next slide, please. This is just a list of what EPA agreed to per that court settlement, and you can see many of these dates have already come and gone. Vulnerable species, which is intended to identify a set of mitigations for those species identified that may be most at risk of pesticide exposures, that is already in place. Herbicide strategy has now been finalized as well, and EPA is working to implement that in individual registration decisions. There are some major milestones that we are expecting coming up, one of which is the insecticide strategy, a final for which is due by the end of March. And EPA also agreed with the partners in this court settlement to set some timelines for the fungicide strategy, which we are expecting to see some activities on starting as soon as April 2026. So this is something you'll see more and more about and hear more on these strategies, no doubt, in the months to come. With that, I believe I'll turn it over to Leah to talk a little bit more about the strategy specifically and what do these entail.
Hi, thanks, Kyle. I appreciate it. We can go to the next slide.
Yeah, Leah, there might be a little bit of a lag, but it's showing on our end. So.
Okay, super. Thank you. I'm sorry. Hopefully y'all can hear me okay. I think I might have been a little bit quiet on my introduction. So picking up where Kyle left off and going back just a little bit to a few things that he said, all of this really started to pick up steam and pick up speed in January of 22 with the EPA announcing their commitment to holding stakeholder calls and complying with ESA. In April of 22, so very soon after that, they released their work plan outlining their approach. And then in November, they released an update to that work plan. So things started moving very quickly from there. In the work plan update that they released in 22, they outlined different interim mitigation measures that Kyle referenced. Some of those were listed as FIFRA interim ecological mitigations to protect non-target species. When these first came out, people talked about them as the pick list. There were a lot of different names that went along with these interim ecological mitigations and the menu that was part of that. Also included in those interim mitigation measures were the programmatic approaches to ESA mitigation, species-specific mitigation through different pilots, and then the ESA geographically specific mitigations, which would be in Bulletin's Lab 2 or BLT. And we're going to be talking about BLT in a little bit, and Megan's going to cover that as well. Next slide, please. So as Kyle mentioned, we currently have 4 strategies that have been released. We have the Vulnerable Species Action Plan, we have the Herbicide Strategy, We have the rodenticide strategy, and we have the insecticide strategy. While the rodenticide strategy is very important, and I do encourage you all to look into it, find information about it, because it will impact agriculture when they start rolling out this strategy. We're going to focus really on the Vulnerable Species Action Plan, the herbicide strategy, and the insecticide strategy. Next slide, please. So what is meant by EPA strategies, and what are those potential changes? Kyle said it, I'm going to say it more than once. The strategies are not self-implementing. They're not just going to show up overnight. You're not going to go get your labels tomorrow and they're going to have changed. It does have to go through the process of registration and registration review. I will say that registration also could potentially include new uses. So there's different ways that the strategies can be applied to different registration decisions and through the registration review process. And we're really going to have to see how that unfolds as we move through the coming year and years. So the strategies address the routes of exposure. So how species would potentially be exposed to the products, either through runoff and erosion or through spray drift. We're used to spray drift as people who apply products. We know that there's spray drift language already on the on labels. This is just changing a little bit about maybe how we're talking about some of that spray drift language and the way it's going to show up on the labels. The rodenticide strategy is different from the other strategies, and so that's why we're going to focus on the ones that we talked about. So these strategies are going to be implemented through the registration and registration review process onto labels. So you'll see changes on labels, and then you'll also potentially see, depending on the product, you will see pesticide use limitation areas and bulletins in Bulletins Live 2. And it's important to remember that BLT is an extension of the label. So it's not, it may be on a web tool, but it's not separate from the label. It is an extension of the label. One of the spaces that comes up a lot recently, especially related to those pesticide use limitation areas, is the extent of those areas. EPA recently released a process to refine those core maps that are used to develop the pesticide use limitation areas in BLT. And so we'll be seeing more of that information come out about those core maps and what those pesticide use limitation areas will look like as we go through registration and registration review process for specific products. So the potential impacts of the strategy. We see the general label mitigations, the way the strategies are currently written, the final herbicide strategy and the draft insecticide strategy. The geographical species specific would be in all of the strategies through the Vulnerable Species Action Plan and both of the other strategies. So when we talk about potential impacts, we're just not talking about the acres that are potentially impacted, but also how growers manage their operations, because now we're talking about runoff and erosion, so things that we haven't really always considered on pesticide labels. There are labels that have restrictions on no-till versus conventional till. There's some soil type restrictions. We have seen some of those on labels prior to the strategies, but not discussed in the same way, in the same manner. So how growers manage their operations, the complexity associated with the mitigations, and how the products work together. Some of these mitigations may be new and may require increased knowledge of the landscape around the field. So what is downslope of the field? What are the attributes of the landscape around the field? So the potential impact is really not just about an individual strategies or an individual strategy or even an individual product, but how the strategies as a whole impact those production decisions that are being made at an individual level and also at that operational level. Because agriculture is not simple, and there's a lot of complexity. Who rents the land? What's the rotation? How do crops move through the rotation? How many products are being used? So it does get very complex very quickly. So looking at efficiencies about how to talk about these strategies and how it's being implemented on the land is extremely important and part of the reason why we have these webinars. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through each of the strategies very briefly. We could probably do a webinar for each of these individually, but the Vulnerable Species Action Plan, the way it's written right now is it would include most outdoor uses of conventional pesticides, including non-residential outdoor uses. It does not include rodenticides. It includes the majority of agricultural and non-agricultural use sites. Currently, it only includes 27 species listed by the Fish and Wildlife Service in the lower 48 states. It does not include Hawaii. It does not include any of the territories. It only includes the lower 48. That is because there is a Hawaii strategy that is separate from all of the discussions we're having today. These are the ranges and the critical habitats of the species that are included in the most recent update to the Vulnerable Species Action Plan. These are not PULAs. And I really urge you to read what's in the red box. These are not PULAs, these are the ranges. We do anticipate that they are going to be refined before they implement the Vulnerable Species Action Plan in registration and registration review, because they are currently working on refining those core maps that inform the pesticide use limitation areas. But these are the species ranges that are in the VSAP right now. Next slide, please. So the final herbicide strategy and the draft insecticide strategy are very similar, and there were substantial improvements when we went from the draft herbicide to the final herbicide, which was really EPA listening to stakeholders. So for the final herbicide strategy, it includes conventional herbicides and plant growth regulators. It's agricultural uses, which include cultivated land, but not pasture grass or rangelands. So that asterisk is very important. The application methods that are included in the strategy are foliar applications, which would be aerial, ground, air blast, and chemigation, as well as soil treatment and granule formulations are all included in that herbicide strategy. For the insecticide draft insecticide strategy, it's very similar. It includes conventional insecticides, insect growth regulators, and miticides. It also includes the same use sites as the herbicide strategy does. And then also application methods are the same. Foliar treatment, including chemigation, soil treatment, treated seeds, and granular formulations. Next slide, please. So these are the species that were identified. These are the ranges and designated critical habitat for the species that were identified in both the final herbicide strategy, which are related to plants and other species that depend on plants, and then the insecticide strategy, which is predominantly insects, but does include aquatics and other species that are dependent on those insects. So these are the ranges for those species or designated critical habitat. Once again, they're not intended to be PULAs, and how we see these roll out are dependent by the product, right? So what, like Kyle mentioned, we haven't seen the strategies be applied to a large number of products yet. And so we're still really waiting to see how they're going to be applied and how EPA is going to use these pesticide use limitation areas and how they're going to address these species in those decisions. But these are just the maps, the ranges of those species, so you can kind of understand the distribution where there may be additional mitigations needed above what is on the label. Next slide, please. So the overview of the final herbicide strategy and draft insecticide strategy, because they are very similar. So for runoff and erosion points, we talk a lot about points in these strategies. For each active ingredient, EPA will determine how many runoff erosion points are required to use the product within each agricultural use site for different application methods. So these points can range from 0 to 9 points. That's what we're seeing right now, and that's what's laid out in the strategies. So this is a field by field evaluation. However, there are some efficiencies that you can bring to this by maybe looking at production systems that may be the same across fields, but each field will have to meet the required number of points to use the product on that specific crop. And I know Megan's going to go into more detail on this. And then for spray drift, for each active ingredient, EPA will determine spray drift buffer distances required to use the product within each agricultural use site for different methods. And then applicators will have to determine how that buffer can be achieved and if it will require an infield spray drift buffer, depending on the adjacent land use and the wind direction. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of the strategies, the runoff and erosion points, like I said, 0 to 9 points, the spray drift buffer distance, you're looking from 0 to 320 feet, also dependent on product. EPA has laid out some options for exemptions depending on production systems. So let's say you have, you're a cranberry grower, you're inside a bog, or you're in a rice paddy. So there's some of these exemptions. There's also exemptions related to application methods. There's some landscape factors, what is downslope from the field, and then there's ways to get measures with the point values. And I know Megan's going to talk about that as well. And the same thing goes for spray drift buffer distance. There are exemptions related to application method where you would not need a buffer. There's the downwind area, so what is downwind of the field. And then there's ways that a grower could reduce the number of buffers, the distance of the buffer. So let's say you're using low boom coarse nozzles, you would maybe be able to reduce that buffer because you're using low boom coarse nozzles, and of course adjuvants are another way to reduce that buffer distance. So that would be product specific. Next slide, please. So when will these changes be implemented? Once again, they're not self-implementing. It's going to take time for them to do this as they move through these registration decisions. Next slide, please. So just some of my concluding thoughts. These are my interpretation. Our interpretation is CSI. It's our understanding of EPA's work plan and strategies. There will be public comment related to how the strategies are applied to specific products. Just like always, we'll go through that same open comment period. So how to show how those strategies are applied. It is likely that over time, all end users will be impacted by the application of the strategies, whether that is through general label language or through pesticide use, and through pesticide use limitation areas where applicable. So if you are inside or somebody you work with is inside a pesticide use limitation area. However, I just want to stress, EPA did make substantial improvements when they went from the draft to the final of the herbicide strategy by giving growers additional ways to reach those points and also providing flexibility in reducing those buffer distances for spray drift. Next slide, please. There are some uncertainties. We know that there could be updates to the Vulnerable Species Action Plan. There could be additional species added to that list. We don't know what the mitigations are and what those final PULAs will actually look like once they're developed. The fungicide strategy, we still don't know what that's going to look like. Really how, because we haven't seen enough examples, how the EPA will apply the strategies to the registration review process, that is still really an uncertainty because we don't know what that's going to look like. And then also what the scope of those pesticide use limitations are and how that'll differ from what the species ranges are. Next slide, please. And lastly, we published a paper through Agricultural and Environmental Letters back at the end of 23. So it is a little bit outdated, but it does give a good overview of what the cost might be for growers to implement some of the mitigation practices that were listed on the mitigation menu as it existed when we wrote the paper in 23. So that's the QR code to go and look at it. It does give a nice overview, a little bit more information, and then just some background on those mitigation practices. With that, I'll turn it over to Megan to give you the next part of this webinar.
Thanks, Leah. You can jump to the next slide. Really appreciate Leah and Kyle setting up the background of how, what, why, kind of how we've come here today. Want to take the next few minutes to go over what this actually looks like on the ground, what are things that we can be doing going into this spring season and beyond, and really set not only yourselves, but any of the farmers that you're working with up for success. So I'm going to talk about some of the key resources and places to go for these tools, get into some examples of what that might look like. Leah and Kyle both have mentioned several of these, but we're going to look at them a little bit closer. So we'll start with Bulletin's Live 2. You can go to the next slide. And the biggest thing here, so you're going to go to the website, you're going to punch in the location, general location of where the field is, the application month. And so right now it does go out 7 months. I would recommend doing this sooner rather than later. So one of the things here is if you have printed this off, so I've printed off saying I'm going to make an application of Liberty Ultra in May. This is what I'm going to say that I have as my assurance that this is what it said and I am covered. So making sure that you have that selected and that printed off is going to be important going forward. So for that product, for that date, the big thing here when you're selecting your product is you do have to have the EPA registration number. Unfortunately, you can't type in a trade name, active ingredient. You do have to have the actual number. So making sure you've got that handy before you go onto the website. type it up. So this is looking at our home farm here. So for this instance, it's telling me that there are no pesticide use limitation areas for this product in that field at that time frame. And so then it would just be defaulting to what is on the general label. Next slide, please. However, you can see if you zoom out, and I didn't select a product, so this is looking at any products with a June application time frame, and the map on the left shows part of Illinois, Indiana. You can see there is defined pesticide use limitation areas. They are all associated with an aerial spray application for the listed products you see to the right. And then what you would see on the second page is exactly what are those limitations and additional parameters for that product for that time frame in that geography. So that's going to kind of be step one, is you're going to have your list of products, go on, see if there are any PULAs associated with that product, and look at what those restrictions are. As we then start thinking about what comes next with the mitigations, our mitigation bucket really falls into two buckets. So you have your runoff and erosion bucket, and then your spray drift. So for the runoff and erosion, there is a map out there for runoff vulnerability, and this was something that, in a lot of cases, you're going to be awarded some points, as Leah talked about, the 0 to 9 points that are needed. You're going to be given some points just given depending on which county you're in. So you can go online, you can find this map. It's in an Excel spreadsheet as well, so you can sort by state and counties to find an idea if you're in a low, medium, high, or very low runoff vulnerability area. Next slide, please. So that's a place. So as an example, in Illinois, 91 of our 102 counties actually are in that lower vulnerability, so we're equated 2 points automatically. Some other examples, and as Leah and Kyle both mentioned, I think, again, it's worth stressing that EPA did listen. They very much so engaged with stakeholders and made a lot of improvements from the draft to the final herbicide strategy, and we are very thankful for that. So some other examples that are on that list and what the points associated with them would be, if you're in a relatively flat field, depending on your tillage type, if you're implementing things like cover crops, if you're a dry land non-irrigated, there's points. If you're using irrigation, there's also points depending on your management. Things like if you have tile drainage, predominantly sand, there's lots of things, lots of a larger variety on the list than what we initially saw. So there's some ways to look at your points from the runoff erosion. Then we look at the spray drift, and we think about buffers, and this is going to change depending if the product is applied the ground application or an aerial application, but that just gives you a couple ideas of what some of those reductions potentially can look like. So as we go through this webinar, and there's been a couple of questions that have come in on a few things, there's a lot of confusion right now on who is actually going to be the ones responsible for educating and disseminating the information. Is that going to be your state extension service? Is it going to be your state Department of Ag? And nobody really has a solid understanding or has really taken ownership of that. So appreciate everyone joining today, and it's really going to be working together and everybody, trying to help each other out as we go through this and as we get more products with these ESA labels to truly understand how this is going to work. There's also been a question, and we'll get into kind of the specifics on some of those record keepings next, which you can flip to the next slide if you'd like. EPA has released a couple tools. There's a PDF version. There's also an Excel version on where you can go to determine how many points you have in a field. And so this is something where I'd say there was a question about some of the record keeping. There is nothing today that requires you to keep records. You can get points for keeping records, and I would strongly recommend that. Where we're going to see the challenge come in is when there's a question raised. So when you or your farmer there's a concern about discrepancy on, did they have enough points to apply a certain product? Did something happen that shouldn't have happened? This is going to be a great place to start by saying, oh, I printed off my bulletins live too, and I've got a copy of my point sheet that I'd filled out, and have that initial base record to back up what you were doing. So these sheets come in, and again, as Leah mentioned, you do need to do this for every field. If you have fields that are managed similarly with similar soil types and slopes, you can probably lump some together for easier reference, but this does need to be achieved at a field level. So you can go in, and then it gives you the breakdown of what all those different types of mitigations are. And you'll be able to see the assigned points value. So in the PDF version that you see here, the points are already shown, and you just kind of score yourself. The Excel tool. You make the selection from a drop down and it'll calculate the points for you. So I would say this is one of the biggest places on really being proactive and planning early. So having, we all know that emergency rescue treatments happen, that we've got breakthroughs of weeds and insect pests in season. But the more we can plan on the front end, the better we're going to be and the less headaches we're going to have going forward. So taking the time to figure out, what is your planned pesticide list for each of those fields. And the other thing to think about is, this is relatively straightforward if you're thinking of a single product. But when we start tank mixing, then all of a sudden we're going to have to look at all of these products, and it is going to come down it's going to default to the most restrictive. So if you have a herbicide that needs, 9 points and you're tank mixing with one that needs 3, then that whole application is going to have 9 points to make sure that lowest herbicide on your list has achieved and met what's needed. So that's going to be the thing to consider going forward as what some of these tank mixes potentially look like. Leah and Kyle both mentioned we don't have a final insecticide strategy yet. Something that, especially representing corn farmers, I'm very anxious to see is what that looks like, knowing that most of our insecticides and fungicides in corn tend to be applied aerially versus with a ground machine. And so, achieving some of these things from a spray drift, spray drift requirements could be more challenging. And so that's going to be something going forward to see what that exactly looks like. So that was kind of looking at, examples of a few points, some ways to do the record keeping. And that's, again, I think going to be very important to have copies of these things that you're doing early in the proactive piece. Now, Kyle mentioned we do have a couple labels that exist today. And so wanted to take a minute to look at that. So you can go to the next slide. So Liberty Ultra's out. And just a few things to note here. As you can see on this slide, page 12. So when you get this new label, when a product goes through the registration, re-registration, new use things, you're not going to see a glaring thing on the front page of this label that says, ESA, look at me, come here. You do have to do due diligence and actually look through the label. So it's in there. This noting on endangered and threatened species is on page 12. You can go to the next slide. You can start seeing some of the specifics outlined here. These, I believe, are on like page 8. And so it's in there a little bit deeper than, again, just seeing something big and bolded right out in front of you. So again, being proactive on the front end and taking time to read through this. So for Liberty Ultra, a few things that we see on here, these are mandatory spray drift mitigation. So when wind speed exceeds 15 miles per hour is something here. You can jump to the next slide. So here is their mandatory buffers then. So 50 foot for an aerial, 10 foot for ground. So that is required. Now, if you think back a couple slides previously where we did see some of the mitigations for spray drift, if you are enacting some of those things, you can reduce that that minimum buffer distance according to the percent on depending on what practice you're doing. So really, the advice here is to plan early. Go out and think about the fields that you have, think about the products that you typically use, that you're anticipating using, get comfortable with the label, even the labels that don't have some of that language today, just start getting comfortable with knowing where to find quickly that EPA registration number so you can look it up in Bulletins Live 2. Play with some of these tools as we get more products registered with these new labels. It's going to be important to just, kind of quickly be able to look at these things. And then, just again, anytime you can print off and keep some of these records are going to be really important just to have when there is a question or a concern about what happened and how were these applications made and what were the conditions in the field. It's hard to look back, we know, in some of these no-till and cover crop situations, if questions arise months later to be able to go back and prove that there was a cover crop there at the time or what that looks like. So just keeping those records, again, nothing's required, just being proactive in what you do keep. I think that's the last slide, but go ahead. Oh, there might be one more. Nope, I think that was it. Okay, so I think that leaves us about 15 minutes questions, which is what we were hoping to do. I think there's been a lot that have come in. I'll turn it back over to our moderator or panelists, and we can dive into some questions.
Thanks. A lot of great information. Appreciate all you participating today. Everybody's on there. So we do have a lot of questions coming in. It's a complex topic, but y'all were able to kind of boil it down and simplify things. And that's very hard to do, as Kyle knows, in Washington, D.C. with all the federal regulations we deal with. First question is, what are your thoughts on the Trump administration making any modifications to the EPA ESA pesticide strategies as it relates to the mitigation measures you laid out, the point systems, and the PULAs? And that's open to anybody to answer.
I mean, I'll happy to take a stab at that one. We, we think that there are continued improvements that can be made. The one thing I will say this is that I think I don't want to speak for my co-panelists here, but this idea of ever going back to a period of non-compliance, like we don't think that that would be appropriate or ever acceptable. We don't want to get back to a point where we're losing pesticide registrations, to court vacatures. But at the same time, we want to make this as workable for agriculture as possible. And while, again, as Leah and Megan noted, there were a lot of improvements that were made from the draft to the final herbicide strategy, and that we've even seen in the draft insecticide strategy, we think that there's still some improvements that could still be made. And our hope is that an incoming administration would, be receptive to our concerns, and we could find ways to continue to work together to make these the landing zone for these strategies and any registrations that result from them, even more workable for agriculture.
Next question: what role will state pesticide certification and training programs have for commercial and private applicators? Basically, what role will they play as these new ESA FIFRA labels are approved by EPA?
Yeah, I would just say, at the end of the day, the label is the law. And so for a lot of things, it's going to default to how label inquiries and things are handled today. As we've mentioned throughout this, the strategies are not a rule. They are guidance to make changes to these labels. So it's going to be working with those agencies, how they've always handled label concerns, and then just being proactive on your end on having some of those records on what's required with the label today. And then, I mentioned it is going to be a challenge depending on your state and their extension resources, their Department of Ags, whoever's working with pesticides in your state on what type of ownership they're going to take in some of this education. But like webinars like this are a great start.
Next question says, instead of NLAA, isn't a no effect required to skip consultation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service?
Yes, that is a true statement. So NLAA requires informal consultation, or Fish and Wildlife has to agree to the NLAA determination. A no effect is required to so EPA makes a no effect, may affect first, and then for the may effects, they do a likely to adversely affect, not likely to adversely affect. So no effect would be the only one that would not require any sort of consultation with Fish and Wildlife. An NLAA would require informal, or for them to concur with that NLAA determination.
Yeah. And this next question's for you. It says, you didn't mention Alaska. We are not a territory, nor are we part of the lower 48 states. Does this strategy apply to Alaska?
So the strategies do not specifically apply to Alaska, but obviously if products are used in Alaska, they would still be required to meet the labels. It's just the strategies only included species that are located in the lower 48 for Fish and Wildlife Service. It doesn't include species that are under the jurisdiction of the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NMFS. It only includes discussion around fish and wildlife species in the lower 48 states. So that's why Alaska is not included in the strategies.
This next one's also for you. It says, you mentioned the strategies don't apply to pasture, grass, or range. Where do forage crops such as alfalfa fall into the strategy?
So alfalfa is considered as part of the cultivated lands, and so it is included in the strategies. EPA has different use data layers that they include, and alfalfa is considered as part of one use data layer that is evaluated as part of the strategies. So yes, alfalfa is included the same as corn, soybeans, wheat, minor crops, etc.
This next one's for anybody. It says, who will monitor and report the points earned by farmers practicing mitigation methods?
Yeah, so kind of touch on this a little bit, but there's, not a central database. There's not going to be anywhere that you're going to submit a report that says, I had 6 points on this field, 9 points on that field. Really, where we see right now, it's going to come into play is when there is a complaint or a question raised about how a product was used or what was happening in that field at that time. And so really, it's going to be on you, on the onus of you to have those records for those fields and just, have on standby if there is a concern raised. I don't know if Leah or Kyle have anything else they want to say about that.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add would be, while I think Megan is spot on in that, and there's not a requirement to keep records. It would likely only come up in instances where there is sort of questions being asked. I would recommend touching base with your state regulatory agencies as well. We did hear that there are some states that are contemplating or kicking around the idea of requiring record keeping regardless. Just knowing that it might help make their enforcement requirements easier, for those state regulators. I know that's still being discussed by the state lead agencies though, so it's probably prudent to check in with them.
And this next question is, and you think you maybe touched on it with the worksheet, but are there examples of mitigations and how it's done at a field level?
Yeah, and we touched on that. I would just default probably to save time going back to look at those worksheets. There is a mitigation menu website that you can go on and look at some examples there as well.
Okay.
I'll
Next
also say, in EPA's documentation, they do have some examples related to the final herbicide strategy if you want to wade through them. The FESTIP, the task force that we work with, we have our insecticide presentation on that website, and we do have some examples of how we interpret it. So there are some examples there too.
The only other thing I would say too, just to add to that, is there was, to their credit, EPA and USDA did a great job of trying to harmonize these mitigations with those that are made available also through NRCS programs and practices. So that can help in instances where there might be like cost share dollars available through NRCS programs and things like that. So keep that in mind also when you're reviewing those mitigation standards, that they did a pretty good job of trying to harmonize those with what USDA makes available.
Yeah. The one thing I'll mention is we've asked EPA to consolidate some of these websites and information so it makes it simpler for CCAs or farmers or anybody to utilize those tools. Next question is, species ranges are very diagnostic. Will they really be used? Or species ranges are not very diagnostic. Will they really be used? Sorry.
Yeah, so what we've seen is if you go into the pesticide, if you go into Bulletin's Lab 2 right now, you'll see a number of PULAs that are already in there. Some of those are based on species range. The hope is as we move through the refinement process where we're refining the core maps, we're going to be able to reduce that to something below species range for that exact reason, because they are not very diagnostic. And so really identifying where the habitat are, what the species needs are. And so based on best available data related to those species from Fish and Wildlife and other groups. And so there is a move to really hope to be able to do that. In some cases, it might not be possible because the species range may already be refined and reflective of that habitat. But the goal is really to refine those to where the protection is actually needed, not at a county level or these larger regional levels. So yes, that is the goal. We'll see how that moves forward.
Yeah. These next two questions are Bulletin Live, so I'll just read both before maybe answering those. When will BLT, Bulletins Live 2, work more rapidly? It does not always work quickly, and I can attest to that as well by trying to go through their system. The next one is with Bulletins 2. Does each individual applicator need to visit the site, or can a company visit for all employees?
Yeah, I can start. There's one further down too that asks about an API with EPA and other ag software. So in general, I think we all agree that some of the software is a little more archaic and cumbersome to go to multiple sites. We have had conversations with EPA about, involving some of the private side to make this a little bit easier. They're open to things, but it is a very slow process. So I would say it's TBD if we're going to actually see some of those come to fruition and streamlining and making that better. For the individual applicator, So essentially, as long as, depending on when those applications are going to be made, the products, obviously, if you're going to go on and you're going to do 5 fields in March that are using that same product, you can print off one of those bulletin live too. You just need to make sure that that's going to be applicable to the field, the product that you're going to be making that application in, and then obviously being able to have that record available for each of those fields if needed.
Yeah, my understanding is that they won't make changes 6 months out from, that's the range for applications. So as long as they're checking, I would recommend checking before you go out in the application just to verify, but check at least 6 months out. The company should be able to keep those records or have them, to your point, as you're planning these applications and working with customers. If you're a retailer, that would be important things. But keeping a record of that and showing you did your due diligence is going to be important. And this goes to the next question, really, because it was mentioned about you don't need to keep records. But does that just only relate to farmers and private applicators for all pesticide products and not that aren't considered restricted use pesticide products? Because commercial applicators would still need to maintain the records, correct?
Yeah, good point of clarity. So with the records that really related and came back to the point system and your spray drift mitigations, so nothing requires you to keep a record that says that you have 9 points in that field. It's just, we're highly recommending that you do print off some of these worksheets and keep records to go back and define. But all other, things about different product applications already where requirements are happening, or even company policy, absolutely those things are not meant to negate the record keeping.
Next question. Curious if anyone knows how this will affect seed treatments, fungicide, and/or insecticide.
Right now, EPA is looking at making, like, for example, the insecticide strategy would at least as drafted would apply to certain aspects of it would apply to seed treatments as well. We're still waiting to see kind of how this all shakes out. We don't have a final insecticide strategy yet. We won't until March, but conceivably that would be part of compliance. It's a type of application, and there would be a need to ensure that there isn't any risks to species or critical habitats from those seed treatments all the same. So right now that is on EPA's scope.
And this may goes to the timing of things. It says, where does fungicides fall into the mix for strategies?
It'll be coming. Kyle, you can probably give more information.
Yeah, they had an original obligation to just sit down and talk and figure out a date for doing that late last year. They did, the parties did, and we're now looking at spring of 2026 for, I think it's April if I remember, for when we're expected to see a draft. So it's a little ways out. Herbicides and insecticides I think took priority, but it's coming.
Yeah. The only thing I'll mention, again, you've got a new administration. They're trying to put their individuals in place. The EPA administrator hasn't even been approved by the Senate as of today, Lee Zeldin, and they have to have all the other sub-cabinet level people as well. And if you saw, the EPA is not exempt from anything of the hiring freeze. So the Office of Pesticide Programs is where some of these decisions are made. So if they're understaffed now, that could slow things up for all of these things as well. So the next question is the cost benefit analysis mentioned in the presentation. What were the general findings of that publication?
That's a great question. So that paper in and of itself wasn't really a true cost benefit analysis. We really did a qualitative discussion about those costs to growers. So we really looked at how what would be the impact to growers from just a qualitative discussion, and then we went through and identified the cost associated with the mitigation measures that were outlined. And so it wasn't a true cost benefit analysis. It was more of a commentary on the policies as it related to those economic costs that would be possible.
The next question is, who's responsible for confirming the points for application, the applicator or landowner if custom applied?
My understanding is that and actually Megan, Leah, feel free to jump in here if you understand otherwise, but I think the responsibility lies with the farmer. I think that's right. There's been some ambiguity about all of this too, because depending upon certain aspects of it, like for example, enforcement of like spray drift buffers, that's going to primarily rest with, the person who's making the application at the time. So this is one of those areas that there's, we're still trying to sift through responsibility.
Yeah, and what makes it complicated too, because you've hired a potential commercial applicator to come in, and based on what they've told them is they've done for mitigation measures to get to your point systems too. So it does get complicated.
Yeah, and I think that some of the conversations that we've had with aerial applicators has been in the space that it really changes the conversation that you're having. And so it really is going to require communication and changing how you're talking about it between the applicator and the landowner and the grower.
Yeah, and this next question for you, Leah, it says, what percentage of the corn and soybean acres will be impacted under the final herbicide strategy?
So I'm going to give you the short answer. It's going to be all of them, right? Because there are going to be label changes. So for anybody who's using pesticides, it is going to impact all of them. As far as the pesticide use limitation areas, we can only talk to the ranges because we don't know what those pesticide use limitation areas are. And so I think that if they want to follow up with me, I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but we could have a conversation off the webinar, but it is going to impact everybody. So at some point.
Yeah, I know we've hit the top of the hour and Jamie's back on. There are several more questions related to that, but we may run out of time. So you want to make any comments, Jamie?
Yeah, I just want to thank you guys for your time. I know Megan's got to hop off here, so thank you for being here. I really appreciate you sharing your insights and your expertise. But if you have any other last words, Kyle or Leah or Richard, feel free to make your case now. Otherwise, thank you.
I would just say again, thanks for the invitation today. And this is going to be continued to be an evolving conversation. Stay tuned. I mean, our recommendations is get up to speed as much as possible and help those in your community to understand some of these foundational elements of the work plan and the proposals, because many of those, while the details may change, some of the details, like we have a suspicion that this kind of underlying approach and strategy is probably here to stay.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people working in this space every day. And so find out who those people are and always feel free to reach out. I think my email is available. Reach out, ask questions, because we're more than willing to talk about it to help this move forward with a successful implementation.
Yeah, the only thing I'll comment is, again, thank you for the really helpful information. Again, this is a complicated issue. It's probably not going to get easier as we move forward with more complicated labels. These first ones are maybe a little bit easier to deal with for the industry. And we look forward to working with you to try to work with the agency to simplify it, to protect, the goal is to protect these endangered species, but also maintain the continued use of these important tools for production agriculture. But we want to make sure it's done the right way for the industry and is achievable for both production agriculture and complying with the ESA Act. So we look forward to working with everybody as this kind of process moves forward and as new labels are approved by EPA.
Amazing. Well, thank you all for your time today, and a special thank you to our sponsors, ARA, CPDA, and CropLife America, for providing this support to the science societies. We do hope to have another follow-up webinar in Q2, but in the meantime, I know there's a lot of other organizations that are doing great work to share this information. There's a webinar this Friday at 11 Central, I believe, by BASF. Speaker is Stanley Culpepper, a weed scientist, great expert. He's been on several other webinars and panels to inform you all. So thank you so much. This webinar will be provided to you shortly this week. But again, thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you soon.